All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody, and welcome to Let Your Code Fly High workshop. So we're here today. Sorry, let me share my screen real quick. Hi, Dachi.
Hello.
Share screen. And okay, here we go. Yeah. So yeah, the idea, as Princia said about this workshop, is to help understand, well, basically get a fairly simple full stack web application running locally, and then go through the steps of how do we actually get that into cloud so that everybody can see your wonderful application, right? So I'm going to be concentrating on Azure for this portion, and we also have Jali who will be doing AWS later in the series. So that will be coming up later. So for today, I'll be going through a simple web application that I have set up already. So let me actually put the link to the GitHub repo in the chat here. And feel free to clone this and follow along or try to get stuff installed. If you have issues, whatever, feel free to ask questions here and stuff. But I'll be walking through today what this application is and what the pieces are and how they're connected to each other and things like that. So to start with, we have a React application, and this was actually a Oktoberfest project that was started by the Frontend track. Actually, Princia started this back in October. So Oktoberfest is basically a celebration of open source that's sponsored by a company called DigitalOcean, and the idea is just to be able to contribute to open source. So we started this. Sorry, the Zoom bar is always in the way. So we started this GitHub repository here for just a React app alone, and this is currently actually hosted in GitHub Pages today. You can go in there and browse around, and I mean, this was great. We had a lot of contributions from members in the community, and this, I mean, what you're seeing here right now was pretty much built in the month of October. 1 month contributions by everyone, and every time you make changes to the repo, it immediately has it live here on this GitHub Pages site. So pretty nice project. Now, the thing about this is it's only React, so some mock data and stuff was used in the background to just show the data that you're seeing on the site that I just showed there. So I took that, and some of the data in there, I made an API using .NET in this case to surface some of the data, and added a database. I chose SQL Server. These technologies, technically, as always in tech, there are a million ways to do things. I just happen to pick these because these are things I've just worked with over the years. I have more experience. That's kind of the reason I picked these. So these are the different parts of our application today. The front end is a React app that talks to an API in the back end, which is a .NET app, and the .NET app surfaces data using the SQL Server database, essentially. So in order to get this running locally on your machine, all these different pieces, these are sort of the tools. So I have used Visual Studio Code here for the development. And there are some of these things for the .NET, you need the SDK. I use a library called Entity Framework to basically communicate with the database. And it lets you generate certain scripts for setting up the database, like creating the tables. This is a relational database, so creating the tables, the schema, populating some data. So that's what some of these tools are for. The node is for the React app to be able to run that locally. And if you want to have SQL Server running locally on a machine, you can get it as a Docker container. So you would need Docker Desktop for that. So these are the tools you would need at this point. Now, let's go through the different pieces here. So first, we have a UI folder for the React app itself. And in order to start the React app, it's pretty simple. You go into the UI folder, and we just do npm start, and that will pretty much start up the React app. Now and it launches a browser. So this is basically the site that I showed before. That now the part that talks to the APIs, a lot of this is static data. So this page here is static, this one's static. So the resources page is what actually talks to the .NET API and is actually trying to get data for it. So let me go back to that real quick. So the API folder here is a .NET, a C# project that basically inside controller is where you have the actual API endpoint. And in this case, we have there are only 2 API endpoints, only one is actually being used by the front-end app. But the idea is to just return some internship data is what it is for the website. So in order to run this, I'll open another terminal here. Go to API. Actually, you can just run it debug. So with Visual Studio Code, you do get the option to just run it in debug mode. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So doing this will basically build the .NET application and run it. And what you see here is something called Swagger. So Swagger is basically a way to generate automatic documentation for your API, where it's able to essentially, so with .NET, it comes with, out of the box when you create a .NET project, it comes with some libraries kind of baked in and built in to generate an API documentation for your API. So in this case, like I said, I have 2 endpoints that are get endpoints, and all like this page and all this stuff I didn't build, like this comes with the library. It's able to read my API and sort of inspect it and say, okay, you have a resource controller, so you have a resources API. This is the data that's going to get returned back from that API. And you can actually like execute, and essentially you can test out your API. So this is a quick and easy way, I would say, to be able to test out your API as you're building it out to make sure that it works as you expect and debug it and that kind of thing. So when you run in the debug mode over here, you can even put breakpoints in here. So when I do this, it should actually hit this breakpoint and I can actually see it going through the motions, essentially. Go. And it returns this data. So now that I have the API running locally, and this is my front-end app running locally, now when I go to resources, this data that you're seeing here, Google Summer of Code, this description, all these things that come up over here are actually coming up from this API over here, this data that you're seeing here. Just to show you, bring up the developer tools. Sorry, should have done this first. But basically, this is where it's calling my, excuse me, API. So my API is just hosted on local 7071 and the web app is on 3000. So this is how you know that it's calling my API and actually, the local API, sorry, and getting the data and surfacing it here. So now it comes to where does the data actually come from, right? So the API here, what you see is this context here is what I refer to as entity framework. So entity framework is, it's called an object relational mapper. And the idea is you're able to get data from relational tables in a relational database, and you're able to convert it to basically objects because C# is an object-oriented language. And then you can essentially give that back as data, which can be converted to JSON since the API has to return JSON back. So entity framework is a library to be able to communicate with the database, query it, or insert data, basically do all that operations that you would do on a database, essentially. So, and here it actually shows with logging, it shows you like all the queries that it's actually doing as it runs, because I'm running in debug mode here. It's actually showing the queries that are as they're hitting the database and coming back. So going to the database, as I mentioned before, we can run it as a Docker container. So there's an image from Microsoft for a SQL Server in Linux container, actually, that I have here. And this is what is running right now locally on my machine. And I already set up the tables and everything in it, tables and the data actually in it, which is why you're able to see right now the API surfacing back that data that you see today, see right now. So in order to do this, to get started with it, sorry. So these are the instructions that I have here to like start from scratch, right? So the first thing when you clone this repository and you have this, in order to populate the data in the database, you can actually run this using an entity framework tool because there are migrations. So actually, let me talk to the migrations a little bit here. So with entity framework, as I said, because it's a library that provides you the way to query the database, it also has, I guess, a framework or a library, you know, to be able to populate the database as you're building it out. So for right now, actually, let me show you here. So I have an extension in Visual Studio Code that lets me query the database. So this localhost one here is connected to the Docker container that I have running. And in it, since I've already created, these are the tables that I have. And let me run a query real quick. So these sources. So this is the data that you're seeing in the API coming back, essentially. So this is where the data lives in this table, well, these tables. And then the API is able to query this, like join through the tables, get the information, create the JSON out of it. And then that's what you see here on the, which is what you saw here on that Swagger page. And that's what actually comes back here. So in this response, this is the JSON that's coming back. And then the React app is able to essentially read that and show the data here, right? So this is essentially how you get it up and running locally. And this is typically what you would see with a web application. You would have, so either this is what's called a single page application because it's React, but you can also have just completely backend actually surfacing the web app, like .NET can do it. Rails is another one that comes to mind with Ruby, and Python has Django, and like there are many different other ways to also, I guess, have this architecture, so to speak, right? And then on the database side, there are also different types of databases. I chose relational database SQL Server. There are others like MySQL and Postgres and things like this as well, or there's NoSQL as another option also. And the data here that you see, fairly simple, so really you could go with anything. It's not too much of a big deal either way, in this specific case at least. Okay, so one thing, okay, so let's go through.
Sunitha, there is a question.
Mm-hmm.
What is the name of the extension to connect to DB container?
Let's see. This one, SQL Server. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and in order to connect to it, the connection string is actually in this app settings development JSON. So because it's running on localhost, when you run the container, now the command that I gave for running the container. So this Docker command right here, actually, probably easier to see it here. Just to explain, I guess. So when you run SQL Server, you always have like what you can call an admin account called SA. So you have to specify what a password for that, just like the initial user for the database, right? And of course, you can go in and create more users. Typically, you would, like in a production scenario, you wouldn't use this password. You would actually create another user to use for connecting to the database and things like that. But in this case, I just went with this one just to keep it simple. But this is the password, and I ran it on 1433. So typically SQL Server normally runs on port 1433. And when you run Docker, you have to map to a port on your host machine. So when you do the -p, it's a port mapping between 1433, this 1433 on the left side of the colon is on my machine, and the 1433 here is on the inside of the Docker container, so to speak. So when I say localhost in my connection string here, typically it uses 1433 when connecting. So because my Docker container is already running on my 1433, that's how it knows to connect to it. And then you have to give username, password, and initial catalog just means the first database that I want to connect to inside the database server. So this is essentially how you can use this exact same connection string to connect when you use the extension as well. Show it real quick. Oh, because I already have it here. But when you do the plus, you can actually paste this full connection string in here and hit enter. And then it would ask you for your username. I think it asked for the username password when I did, or it didn't. And then it'll actually connect in there. So you can just put the connection string in here after you click the plus. It's funny, I'm actually used to other tools with connecting with SQL Server. So this is actually the first time I used this extension. It's pretty nice, I have to say. How much Visual Studio Code gives you is pretty cool, actually. Okay. Sorry, Princey, were there any other questions?
No, that's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No problem. Yeah, so I think the migration is what I was talking about before. So the migration here is basically a framework that any framework gives you in order to be able to create the tables. So this is where it can actually create the tables according to the schema that I wrote through C# classes, basically. So using C#, you can create the classes, and then Entity Framework will create this. So these were all generated through Entity Framework tools, basically, in order to create this and then be able to run the command to just create the tables in the database, essentially. So if I want to add more tables or something like that, basically in this models folder, I would create another class with whichever properties, columns would be in the table. And then you can run the .NET tool command in order to generate what's called a migration to be able to then create that table, that kind of thing, and then run it against your database, essentially. So one thing I do have in here, if you don't want to run SQL Server locally, is you have an option to run an in-memory database. This is something that Entity Framework gives you as an option. So what happens here is if I stop this. So if I comment this out here, comment that out here. This is basically, so this program CS is a startup for the API, the .NET API. And this is where it's setting up like different things within different features, I guess, within the API itself, essentially to hook it up and have everything ready to serve requests. So this portion here is where it's actually setting up the database, like the connection to the database. So this portion that the portion that I commented out, sorry, says use SQL Server. So it was that's how it was connecting. That's how it was set up to connect to the SQL Server. But if I don't want to have SQL Server running, if I don't want to have Docker, I can install SQL Server locally for some reason. You can choose to use an in-memory database that Entity Framework gives you. And this essentially mimics, so you can do the same querying and all that kind of thing. You can even run these migrations on the in-memory database, and it sort of behaves like that. It's just you're not running against an actual SQL Server, but you can still use it to test out your API, and it can even be used for if you want to run some integration tests or something like that, which I realize I don't have tests in here. I'll have to add them later. But that also is an option if you, excuse me, if you don't want to run Docker locally or don't want to install SQL Server locally, basically. So this is, and then one other thing I do want to point out in here, which is something I've seen before when it comes to setting up a full stack application locally, where you need to have your web application be able to talk to an API. It's something called CORS. So what happens is, as you saw for the web app, it's hosted on, well, locally here for me. It's hosted on localhost 3000, and then my API, is on localhost 7071. So they're seen as two different domains. And what happens is when the JavaScript app, or the React app in this case, has to make a call to the API, if I don't allow CORS, then it will actually give a CORS error is what will happen. And this is one of the first things I ran into when I was setting this up. So just to show you what that looks like really quick. So if you ever have to, I guess, make your own or something, this is something to keep in mind that will have to be set up. So if I do that and run it. Right. So, and also in the React app itself, sorry. So now if I refresh this, it will actually give me an error that it's been blocked by a CORS policy, because what's happening is the origin is localhost 3000, which is the web app, but it's trying to access a resource, like it's trying to call localhost 7071. So the browser sees it as you're trying to go across domains and sees it as like a security risk. So it actually blocks the request from happening. So when you enable your API to actually allow CORS, and what I've done is I've only allowed it for localhost 3000, since I know that's where like my app is actually hosted. So this way, by doing this, it allows the request to come through, because the browser will first say, hey, can I make this request? And the API will say, yes, you can. So then it will actually then, it's what's called a pre-flight request. So you will see like two in the network tab, you'll actually see two requests going to the API. That's just one other thing to bring up. That's all that I have for this running locally. So you can feel free to clone this and try this for yourself as well if you want to. So in the future sessions, one of the things that we will be able to do is once you have this running, or once you have this available locally on your machine, you have the option. Visual Studio Code comes with extensions that lets you publish it directly to Azure. And I mean, since I'm going to be showing Azure, you would be able to do that. And we'll go through that to see how you actually publish to cloud. That's one way. But then typically, like when you're working on a team or when you're working on something that's of, I guess, a bigger scale, I would say, then you wouldn't generally publish directly from your machine. You would use some sort of a like a different tool essentially, where once you check in your code, it will actually run some automated process to actually push it out to Azure for you. And that will be something we'll also go through in future sessions to show what that looks like. So, but for now, just wanted to show what is it that we're going to be using. One of the things with cloud is always like, what do I use? And you always have to have some existing application in order to be able to deploy it to cloud. So this is like a beginning thing, basically, to be able to say, okay, this is what we will use in future sessions to now be able to deploy it to cloud, and the different ways that we can do it as well, because there are different services in the cloud that we could potentially use as well to be able to host this. So those will be in future sessions. So yeah, I think that's all I have to share. If there are any other questions.
Cool. Yeah, I think it runs on my machine. So it does run on Sunitha's machine. Thank you for that. Folks, like, do you have further questions? Or maybe like, yeah, Sunitha, you can just give like a very short overview about what to expect in the next sessions. Just to like, to give an idea about what's happening on on the immediate next event, and then events after that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't actually have the schedule with me, but it's also kind of subject to change. But just to give
Yes.
some idea of what we might be going through in the next session. So this is this is the Azure portal where you can actually create the resources. So I'm going to be using Azure in the next one, and AWS will be coming. I think in March, I believe, is where we'll be doing AWS. So basically, you can set up Azure SQL. You can set up a web app. It's called Azure App Service in order to host the application. So this is sort of what I'll be going through, how to do it through using the portal first. I'd like to show using the portal, what are the different resources that you would be making in order to put this together. And it is different services. So there's SQL, and then there's the app service for the web application, the two, I guess, web applications, React app and the API, and how to make them talk to each other and that kind of thing. So these are the sorts of things this is what I'll be talking about in the next session. In future sessions, I also like to go through the automation process for doing this. And even with that, there are different ways you can use Azure CLI, or you can use something like Terraform used in the past. There's also ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager templates in Azure that you can use to deploy in an automated fashion. So those are also the things that I'd be going through. Don't know for sure if all of that will be in the next session, but at the very least, we'll get this local one into Azure using this in the next session, using the Azure portal for sure. So
Cool. Yeah, and I guess after that will be the AWS thing, which Jolie will do for this
that's right.
Yeah, AWS S3 CloudFront. And then we have the Kubernetes session, right? After that, which you will do.
Yeah. So later on, Kubernetes technically is a little heavy for this application, but I figured it's a good way to show, again, just how to get different things talking to each other and maybe give some sort of introduction to some of the basic concepts in Kubernetes, and then
Yeah.
we can kind of see how it will be running. So
Yes.
yeah.
So that's like the overall agenda that we have. Just let us know, maybe on Slack, maybe on social media, if if you want or looking for something else. So here's a question, Sunitha, from Stamashia. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Sorry if not. I just found out about this webinar. I'm currently in a web dev full stack program, but I'm not on JS React yet. Will this webinar be available?
As in, will this be available as a recording? Is that what the question is, I guess?
That's what, yeah, I asked for clarification too. Yes, this will be available as a recording. And oh yes, okay. Yes, it will be available as a recording. And if you're looking for a JS React kind of content, then yeah, you can join our Slack study group. I've pasted the link there. And for March, we are working with a network from Mexico to start a beginner level JavaScript series. So that might be helpful. And the focus will be on React. Cool.
Awesome. Very cool.
Yes. So yeah, we are done like kind of early. If you all have questions, maybe we can hang around for a few minutes. I
Yeah,
know it's
that's not a
very early,
problem at all.
very early to some of you. So really appreciate you all taking the time to attend this one. But otherwise, yeah, just let us know questions via Slack, social media. We'll take it ad hoc or async.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely join us in Slack, and feel free to ask any questions at any point in time. Happy to help. Anyway.
Yes. And thank you, Sunitha. Thank you so much for the session. It was great. Really like good start of part one. Looking forward to the others. And thank you for everyone for joining. Thank you, Jachi. Thank you, Sierra.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, then. See you all again in 2 weeks. And yeah, have a nice day. Have a nice time, whatever time it is for you.
Whatever time it is, yes.
Okay, there is one more question. Do we need to familiar on C# or .NET for coming session?
That's a good question. I think no. To be honest, the actual inner workings of the code, I think, are not going to be important. We just need something in order to, deploy, right? Is the idea. And I wanted to show it just so you're at least somewhat familiar with, what are the technologies used, how are they connected to each other. I think that's very important, because when we deploy to cloud, one of the biggest things that I find becomes an issue is, I have my SQL Server, I have my web application, I have this other web application. Now, how do they all talk to each other, right? Like the connection string that I showed before, for example, things like that. So I think it's really more that. The only reason I think, I don't see that you need to have familiarity with any of it, either React or C# or anything. It was just what I picked, like I said, because that's what I am. It's just what I'm most familiar with. So that's the only reason I went for those. So yeah, I don't feel like you should need any. We won't actually be diving into any of that code in future sessions, right? So future sessions are all going to be, in the portal, going through the different services in cloud, what we can use to deploy this application with the database, basically. So there won't be any, we won't be looking at any code in the inner code. So yeah, I don't think you would need any familiarity with C#. I mean, it's great if you want to learn it, that's perfectly fine. But if you don't, if it's too much, I completely get it, and you definitely don't need to worry about it. I don't think so.
Yeah, I think what would be definitely useful is, like Sunitha said, your understanding about how applications work locally. So it's like, how maybe a full stack application works. Yeah, that's like front end, yes, but front end needs to connect to the API, how the code for API is written. So it's irrespective of which language you choose, knowing some of the basics, or maybe asking questions around that. So like, irrespective of if the API is written in C# or JavaScript or Java or Ruby or Python, I think that underlying fundamentals about that would be useful. So then, like, it's there on your machine, and then how do you deploy this very code on the cloud, and then what are the resources that you allocate, and how do you provision things on the server, what is Azure, what is AWS. So these kind of things, this kind of mindset would be helpful.
Yep, totally agree.
Cool. Then, yeah, thank you again, and see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.